Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from today. We are so very glad that you are here with us. Welcome to our June webinar series brought to you by your trusted partner in public sector human resources, CPS HR Consulting. Today, we are diving into modernizing minimum qualifications presented by CPS HR Senior HR Consultant Jeff Burkaw. We've got a fantastic session ahead, but before we jump in, there are a few quick housekeeping notes to get through. So today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email tomorrow with the link to watch the replay and access the session slide deck. So both will be available to you. Everyone is in listen-only mode to help keep our audio very crystal clear, and we encourage you to use the chat to connect and share ideas throughout the session. If you have any questions for our speaker, please drop them anytime into the Q&A box, and we will answer as many as we can at the end, time permitting. Now, without further delay, I'm going to hand it right over to Jeff. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Marissa. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. There's a lot I want to cover. Let's just lay some groundwork real quick. Minimum qualifications. What are they? Minimum qualifications, of course, are certain types of education and experience that we require an applicant to possess in order to bring them into our selection process. And they're generally statements of education and experience that indicate that an applicant is at least minimally qualified for a particular job, right? Well, we all know that. But how do we know that? How do we know that those minimum qualifications actually indicate that someone is minimally qualified for a particular job? So, what do our minimum qualifications actually tell us about an applicant? Well, there are a lot of problems with minimum qualifications. If you don't develop them correctly, they can be ineffective. Um, they can screen out qualified applicants, so people who, you would be otherwise qualified for the job. You can screen them out if they're not developed correctly. And in worst case scenarios, they can actually discriminate against people. They can cause disparate impact. So what can we do about that? How can we be sure that our minimum qualifications are valid, they're job related, they're fair, and defensible? And so I'm going to argue, as I have done before, it starts by thinking about our minimum qualifications differently. We need to reframe minimum qualifications. We think about them differently, and where they sit in the hiring process, we can start to create ones that are better, that are more valid. That's what we're going to be talking about. Hello again, welcome. Everybody, thanks for joining me. If this sounds a little bit familiar, full disclosure, I did pretty much a very, very similar webinar just a couple years ago. So a lot of this information, if you're one of our regulars, a lot of this will sound familiar. But there's been a lot, I would say, more interest in minimum qualifications lately, especially when you were hearing things about like moving to skills-based hiring and eliminating degree requirements. And degree requirements are often based on just assumptions about what makes people minimally qualified. So there's kind of a move away from that. So again, there's sort of a new interest, I would say, in minimum qualifications, and that's really great. So I want to talk about what minimum qualifications are, how we use them, how we typically develop them, and the problems that this can cause. And so by reframing our thinking about minimum qualifications and how we develop them, and again, where they sit in the hiring process, we can start to develop minimum qualifications that are frankly better. They're more valid, they're more fair, they're defensible, they're going to work better for us. I'm also going to talk a bit about preferred or desirable qualifications, that additional screening that we do of applicants that we don't really talk about very much. And we certainly don't talk much about how to develop preferred or desirable qualifications that are also valid and fair and defensible. So toward the end, I'm going to talk about that. So let's think about our hiring process. You could think of it as kind of this continuum that starts with the recruitment phase. So we have a job opening, we advertise for it, we create a job announcement, and our job announcement is usually based on our job description. It's got the description of the job and the duties and all of that kind of stuff. And it's got our minimum qualifications in it, usually. And usually these minimum qualifications are kind of built into this job description and they've been there forever and ever and they're just sort of accepted. Um, so we do our minimum qualification screen as the applications come in. We screen people, make sure that they're qualified to move on to the selection process. And then the selection process, of course, is going to lead to identifying who we ultimately want to hire. And then remember, the selection process can encompass all sorts of things. There could be additional screening like supplemental application questions, and then the actual testing, like interviews, paper and pencil tests, performance tests, things like that. And then what we often call a final interview or hiring interview, or your selection process might just be just an interview. Whatever it is, that's how we're picking the best people or the best person that we're ultimately going to hire. You can also think of the two halves. You can divide our hiring process into two halves. And the first half, the half over on the left side is where we're really dealing with applicants. So applicants are people from the outside. We're reaching out to try to bring people into our organization. Um, and then we're going to do a minimum qualification screen, and anyone who is minimally qualified gets to move on to the selection process, and then they become candidates. So that's the difference between applicants and candidates, is if they've been selected to move on into the selection process. And of course, a big purpose for minimum qualifications and doing the minimum qualification screen is to take a large applicant pool and reduce it down into a smaller candidate pool. So we might get, 200 people applying for a particular job. We only want to interview maybe 20 people or so, but we probably don't have to worry about a lot of those people because a lot of them are just not going to be at least minimally qualified. So, um, so again, taking applicants, larger applicant pool, using our minimum qualifications to reduce it down to a more manageable candidate pool, and then those candidates go into our selection process. Another way to look at the hiring process is those two halves. That first half is really the recruitment side. And then that second half, when the selection process starts and then hiring, that's really the selection phase. Now, a lot of us use the term recruitment sort of generically to refer to the entire hiring process. When we have an opening, so we have to do a recruitment, and that means advertising all the way to hire and onboarding. But technically, recruitment is really just that part of the process where you are reaching out into the world to find people to bring them into your selection process. All part of having the open and competitive exams like we do in the public sector. So let's look at the minimum qualifications. Well, where did they come from? So as I said, they're often just kind of written in the job description. They've been around forever. We kind of use them often without question. Let's look at a typical hiring process. See if this sounds familiar to you. So we have an opening. We need to fill a position. And so you create a job announcement, um, or an exam announcement usually using the job description. The job description is going to have a definition of the job, general description. It's got all the distinguishing characteristics and the essential duties and functions, and usually our minimum qualifications are right there in the job description. So we come up with the our job announcement with all of that information. We put it out there in the world. We advertise for our job, and applicants start putting in applications and sending in resumes and all of that. Meanwhile, while the application period is still open, we're going to be working on developing our selection process. Now, if you do a selection process correctly, you are doing some kind of review of the job, like a job analysis, for example. In a job analysis, I'll talk more about it in a few minutes, but Basically, in a job analysis, you're studying a job to identify the most critical tasks performed on the job. Then you're looking at those tasks to determine what knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, are required for performing those particular job tasks. And then those are the things that we're going to be focusing on in our selection process. So, based on the relative importance of all those different KSAs, you're going to come up with an exam plan, figure out what you're going to be testing for, and how you're going to go about it. Then you're going to develop your selection tools, whatever they are. Let's just say it's maybe just an interview. You're going to develop an interview to get at those different knowledges and skills and abilities that you identified by studying the job. So it all sounds good, right? Uh, do you see any problems with this? And this is what we do, right? This is fairly typical. Well, if you take a look at this, everything down at kind of on the bottom here, this is the selection phase of the hiring process. The selection process is likely to be job related. Job related just means it means valid. It means we are only testing for things that are absolutely needed for performing the job. So it's going to be a fair, a fair process. So your selection process is likely to be valid and job related because it was developed based on studying the job. What are the actual requirements of the job? And then how do we go about testing those and all of that? But if you look up at the top, our minimum qualification screen is up there. Minimum qualifications, um, like I said, they're usually taken from the job description or somewhere around, but they're not typically developed with as much thought to to validity and fairness and all of that because they're not typically thought of as part of the selection process. So minimum qualifications are often not based on any kind of studying the job, any kind of job analysis results, or not current results. They've often been around for a long time and are not really based on anything except often assumptions. And I'll talk about that in a section about how they're often based on various different assumptions about the job. Let's look at an example of a job. So the position is it's an IT help desk. Um, it's a journey level job. And so, we might be requiring, for an education minimum qualification, we want everybody to have at least a bachelor's degree in computer science and 2 years performing help desk duties. Very common. You see minimum qualifications like this all the time, bachelor's degree and certain kinds of experience. Well, but what you need to ask yourself is why? When you see your minimum qualifications and they're established already, ask yourself why? Why are we actually requiring a bachelor's degree in computer science? And why are we actually requiring 2 years performing help desk duties? Now, maybe these are good minimum qualifications, but they could have been developed a long time ago, and we don't really know. And you've got to be able to demonstrate job relatedness. In just a minute, I'll talk about why that's the case. But your minimum qualifications need to be based on what is actually required for the job. And it really goes back to this document that you may or may not be familiar with, but all the way back in the 70s, the all of the federal agencies that enforce civil service laws, EEOC, the Department of Labor, Department of Justice, the Civil Service Commission, which is now Office of Personnel Management, they all got together and they developed this document that was a guide for employers to basically what they need to do in a selection process um, in order to make sure that the process is valid, um, valid and fair and all of that. And so they define what an employee selection procedure is. And so they said, and this is an exact quote right at the very beginning of this document, employee selection procedures include job requirements, physical education experience, and an evaluation of the applicants or candidates on the basis of, and then it lists all of these things, application forms, interviews, performance tests. So all of that testing, all of that selection stuff. And then very important at the bottom, it says any other procedures used to make an employment decision. Now, this is really important. An employment decision is anytime you are singling out an individual for some kind of special treatment in an employment context, which could be hiring, promotion, that's special treatment in an employment context. So anything you're doing to select people for that or to make that employment decision is considered a selection procedure and therefore needs to be developed in a way um, that demonstrates its validity. Now let's look at the first part of this statement. Employee selection procedures include job requirements, so physical requirements, education, experience. So what does that look like? Look, minimum qualifications. So minimum qualifications are a type of employee selection procedure. And then the guidelines go on and say the procedure by which persons are identified as candidates is itself a selection procedure under the guidelines. So remember earlier I talked about how we're taking applicants and figuring out which of those applicants are going to become candidates in our selection process. Well, just that screen right there is a selection process or a selection procedure. And so it's got to be valid. Now you might be saying, well, why do we care about this old document employee guidelines? Um, Uniform guidelines, they was written back in 1978, so it's a very old document at this point. But if you don't know, uniform guidelines kind of became the standard for employment testing and still continues to be for this, to this day, decades after this document was put out. The guidelines are still referred to by judges, by courts and civil service commissions, and whenever any kind of government entity is looking at a selection process to determine if it was valid, they often go to the uniform guidelines and look at what it says. So we need to treat it like it is, like it's the law, basically. So let's go back to the hiring process and look at that. So again, if we look at it on a continuum, we start with, recruitment and advertising. We've got our minimum qualification screen. Then we've got our selection process now where we've pared down that group of applicants and now they're candidates. And then we're going to figure out who we're going to hire. But this is how we really should be thinking about minimum qualifications. Let me back up for a second. So it usually goes recruitment, then the minimum qualification screen, then we move over to the selection process. But based on what I was just saying, what the uniform guidelines say we should be doing, is really think about minimum qualifications as part of our selection process. So we recruit, advertise, we bring in we've got applications and resumes. We're taking a look at those. And first, we're looking at the minimum qualifications, doing that screen, but that's still a selection decision that we're making. So it's part of the selection process. We do our screen, then we have our other selection things, additional screening, the actual so-called testing, other interviews and whatever, and then we go on to the hiring process. So minimum qualifications, therefore, they need to be developed the way that you would develop any other selection tool, and that is really with job analysis. When I did a similar webinar a couple years ago, I got a lot of feedback from people saying that they don't do job analysis or don't even really know what it is. You may do some form of job analysis without even knowing it. But job analysis really is kind of a generic term for a systematic study of a job where you're looking at a job and you're identifying all of the important things that people do on the job and ultimately identifying the most critical job tasks. What do people have to do on that job where if they didn't do those tasks or they didn't do them correctly, they would essentially be failing at that particular job. So job analysis is a way of identifying that and using subject matter experts and talking with people who perform the job and supervise the job. And there are lots of different methods for doing that. But you identify the most important job tasks, then you take a look at those job tasks and you identify all of the different knowledges, skills, and abilities that are needed for performing those particular job tasks. Then, so you're going to identify a whole bunch of knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, that are important for performing that particular job. But within those, there's going to be a subset of KSAs that are needed upon hire or day one on the job versus learned on the job over time. There are a lot of things that we know or know how to do in our job that we didn't know day one on the job, but we developed it over time once we were hired. So there are a few of those important knowledge, skills, and abilities that are absolutely needed day one on the job, and that's what we focus on when we do any kind of selection process. So if you do a good job at developing, a valid selection tool, like say an interview or whatever, this is the kind of thing that you're doing. You're studying the job, identifying those critical tasks, and then identifying the most important knowledge, skills, and abilities, and then you're testing for those particular knowledge, skills, and abilities. So you need to develop your minimum qualifications in the same way, basically. Well, how do you do that? Well, this is really key. You look at those KSAs from your job analysis, you've identified which are most important, and then you're going to figure out, with the help of subject matter experts, what kinds, how much and what types of education and training and experience would demonstrate likely possession of those particular KSAs. So those KSAs that you identified in your job analysis process at least a minimum level. So let's look at just some examples. So let's say the job is a finance analyst, and these are some important KSAs. There would be a lot more, but this is an abbreviated list. There are three knowledges and a couple of skills. So knowledge of business statistics, knowledge of state and federal tax laws, knowledge of financial modeling practices, and then a couple of skills to perform some of the activities of the job, skill to analyze financial statements, and skill to review expenditures to determine conformance with budget allocation. So very important things that people have to know in order to perform the job as a finance analyst. But if we're developing our minimum qualifications, this is what happens a lot. Rather than looking at those KSAs and figuring out what would indicate that someone has those at a minimum level, we often do this. We often say, well, it's a journey level position in the finance department, so we should require a finance degree. And you might be thinking, well, that's kind of simplistic. We wouldn't, be that simple about it. Well, actually, I see this all the time, though. A lot of agencies will have almost a general rule that anything that's journey level, we want at least a bachelor's degree or, some kind of degree, maybe an AA degree or whatever, just kind of minimum. And if it's in the finance department, well, probably should be a finance degree, but that's not necessarily going to get you the best minimum qualification or one that's fair or one that's valid or get you the minimally qualified people. You need to reframe it. You need to think about it in a different way. So not this is what we should require because it's journey level, but the knowledge required to perform the job could be acquired through formal education. That's your first determination. And then you might determine that a degree in finance would indicate likely possession of the critical knowledges, at least at a minimum level. You might end up at the same place. You might end up saying, yeah, a finance degree is what's needed, but it's a matter of reframing it so that you develop it in a valid way. Same thing with experience. And I see this all the time. You know, the thought is we need someone to do complex work in the finance department, at the journey level. And so therefore we should have someone, we want to get someone who's got experience working in a finance department. It makes sense. We have a finance department. We have a position. Let's find people who have already worked in a finance department. That's a great minimum qualification. Well, not necessarily. You want to think about it this way. What would it take to be able to do this job at a minimally acceptable level? And don't just think of the job as work in the finance department, because that could mean any number of things. You look at your job analysis results, and you identify what are those most important tasks. One of them might be analyzing financial statements. So, what would it take for someone to be able to do that? Not just work in the finance department, but to actually analyze financial statements. and other things that these people have to do. But this comes directly from our job analysis where we've identified those critical job tasks. And maybe just experience analyzing financial statements, that's probably good, but it's not very specific. But another problem is if we require experience either working in a finance department or even experience analyzing financial statements, there could be people out there who are qualified to do our job and they would be able to analyze financial statements, but who haven't actually done that before. They don't have that experience, but if they could do the job, we're eliminating people that we don't want to eliminate. So you want to look at these tasks and think about, well, what does it really take to be able to do that? And what kinds of knowledges and skills would it take to do that? And you might think, well, actually, someone doesn't have to have experience doing this, but if they had, say, knowledge of financial reporting principles, they might be able to kind of figure out how to do it. Or if they've got experience analyzing large sets of numerical data, they might be able to do it. So people can often do tasks that they've never done before by either applying knowledge, like procedural knowledge, how to go about it, or what are the basic principles of something, and you can sort of figure it out. But if you add to that what we call skill transfer, um, they might be able to do it because skill transfer is where if you've done something that's similar, you might be able to perform a particular task that you've never done before by sort of applying that skill, by transferring the skill to a new thing. So very often, uh, if someone has done something similar and they've got some base knowledge of how to do that other thing, they can do that thing without having actual experience of it. And this is a way by thinking about, thinking it through, like what it really takes to be able to do these particular tasks. We can come up with minimum qualifications that are not going to screen out people that we don't want to screen out. So we also want to think about the right level of education. So what is the appropriate level of education for this job? Well, that's not really going to get you at the right at the right level. If we said this is a journey level job, and so probably a bachelor's degree. Or, like I said, I see a lot of organizations that practically have a rule that just like anything journey level, it's going to be bachelor's degree and, super journey and above that, it's going to be like master's degree preferred or whatever. But that's not necessarily going to get at it. So you don't want to think in terms of what's the appropriate level for the job as a whole, but you want to go back to your job analysis results and think about what are the specific knowledges, because mostly in a formal education, we're talking about knowledge. You're probably not learning skills to do various things that you're going to have people doing on this job, but you're learning this base, knowledge. So you want to ask, how much education would it take to have acquired this knowledge at a minimum level? Knowledge of business statistics, knowledge of state and federal tax laws, knowledge of financial modeling practices. So three, very important or critical knowledges. What would it take? And then you identify the level. And of course, using subject matter experts, you identify a particular level. But you also want to look at the types, and it has to be the right type of education. And very often I will see in minimum qualifications, bachelor's degree required. It doesn't say in what. It's really hard to argue that a bachelor's degree in anything is going, in any one thing is necessarily going to give you, the knowledge needed to do any particular job. It's just too broad. So you need to specify exactly what, but again, you don't just say this is a finance job, therefore they should have a degree in finance. Um, you don't know what's in the different degree programs without researching, and you're not going to research the degree programs for 100 people applying for your job. So you want to go back to those specific knowledges and say, okay, if someone has a degree or whatever, what should the content of that have been in order to have gained knowledge of business statistics, knowledge of state and federal tax laws and financial modeling practices? So if it's a certificate program, specifically what kinds of certificates, not certificates related to accounting or something necessarily, but what would give them those particular knowledges or courses in what, like what kind of, coursework and specifically what kind of a degree. You have to remember that we're using our minimum qualifications as a proxy for the knowledge and skills. We're making assumptions. So we want minimum qualifications that will allow us to be reasonably sure that someone had gained that particular knowledge, skill, or ability by having done something, gotten certain experience or certain education. So let's say that with the help of subject matter experts, and this is really important that you use subject matter experts to help you translate your KSAs into what it looks like in the real world in their field in terms of education experience. So let's say you've landed on associate's degree, that's going to be the right level, but you've specified in finance, accounting, or related fields. So you've narrowed it down. But even better, to make sure that people have, or likely have the right knowledge, you would want to specify some certain coursework in business statistics, tax law, and financial modeling. So you can be very specific in your minimum qualifications when they are based on those specific KSAs identified in your job analysis, not just making assumptions about the kinds of knowledge people have to have just because they're working in the finance department. And then experience. You want to identify the right amount of experience. That's one thing. So not just generally how much experience should people have doing this kind of work, but again, you want to look at those specific job tasks. To be able to analyze large sets of numerical data, what would it take? What would how much experience are you looking for so that people could come into our job, sit down on the job day one and start doing this? What would that take? And you again work with subject matter experts to figure out what that amount is. Is it 2 years? No, that's probably not quite enough. Maybe 3 years. But remember, we're only identifying the minimum level. Um, very often when people are developing minimum qualifications, they start thinking about that preferred candidate and like, well, we really want people to have 4 years experience or whatever. Um, so we want to keep in mind that we're looking for that minimum. We're probably not going to select people right at the minimum. We're going to select people who have probably have more than that, and they've got lots of great knowledge and skills way above the minimum. But this is just to let people into our selection process and to make sure we're not eliminating people who are actually qualified. Another important thing to remember is that more, and this goes for education or experience, more isn't necessarily better. I think we have all run into people in our lives who have been in a job for a very long time, 10 years, 15, 20 years, and aren't necessarily better at their job than people who have been there for 5, 6, 8 years or something like that. More isn't necessarily better. And again, we're only identifying just that minimum. But let's say with the help of our subject matter experts, we've identified that 3 years, it would really take 3 years experience analyzing large sets of numerical data to be able to sit down on day one and do it on our particular job. But you want to identify the type of experience. So, in what context was this done? What kinds of sets of numerical data? Did you work in a finance department? Did you work in the public sector versus the private sector? Maybe that actually matters, or maybe not. So looking back at our finance analyst KSAs, and keep in mind this is an abbreviated list, but let's say these are just the absolute most critical things. Remember, you're not developing minimum qualifications based on everything that's important. Just the most critical things. You want to make sure that all of everyone coming into your selection process has at least a minimum amount of the most critical things. That's what we're looking for. So let's say we've landed on associate's degree in finance, accounting, or related field with coursework in business statistics, tax law, and financial modeling, 3 years experience, analyzing large sets of numerical data in a public sector finance or accounting department. So we've really, really narrowed it down. We're very, very specific, but it's all based on what, how people would have likely gained those knowledges and skills, everything that was identified in our job analysis. It's not based on assumptions. And then, of course, there are equivalencies. There are always lots of different ways that people can demonstrate that they've got that particular experience. Remember, there's nothing in minimum qualifications, there's nothing special about a particular degree, or there's nothing special about a particular kind of experience in itself, but we are, as I said, using that as a proxy for the knowledge, skills, and abilities at a minimum level. So we're assuming that, that's a great way, like an associate's degree in finance, that's a great way that someone could have obtained that particular base knowledge, say. But you always want to look at your minimal qualifications and ask, what other ways could someone demonstrate that? There's maybe some other way out there we haven't thought of where someone could have gained the same knowledge that most people gain in that, associate's degree program. So you always want to think about that. Could it be more coursework? Could it be not necessarily an associate's degree, but specify kind of numbers of courses or whatever? Certain certifications. I've run into a lot of situations in developing equivalencies where people didn't have certain experience or education. If they've got a particular certification, that would really show that they've got it, especially if it's a certi certification where they're required to have certain kinds of experience and education. So that certification serves as a nice proxy for them having all of that stuff. Specific experience, any other kind of experience that um, might make up for not having an associate's degree. And then, of course, um, equivalencies for experience. If people don't have, the 3 years experience. What if they only have 2 years experience? But is there something that could make up for that? Is there some other way that they could demonstrate that they've got that? Um, the knowledge and skills and abilities at the minimum level. So could it be more education? Would it make up for, if they had, say, if they had a bachelor's degree, say you're requiring an associate's degree and 3 years experience, what if they had a bachelor's degree and 2 years experience? It's possible. And of course, if you've developed these equivalencies, that's kind of what you have to do. You have to figure out they didn't have this, how much more of this could they have, or what other kind of thing. Now, a big problem, um, a big mistake a lot of people make in developing the equivalencies is assuming like a year for year substitution, like saying if if you're requiring a bachelor's degree, but someone only has an associate's degree, let's require 2 more years of experience because that's what people are missing. If they don't have the bachelor's degree, they're missing that 2 years. But think about, a bachelor's degree in a particular field. You're not doing that one thing. You're not just studying finance solid for 2 more years. There are a lot of other courses and whatever. So there isn't always a one-to-one equivalency when you're doing that. So you really have to work with subject matter experts to determine, well, how much more of something would it take, or what other kinds of experience? You have to really kind of get creative. Don't assume, maybe we've landed on experience analyzing large sets of numerical data, but you know, maybe there are other ways other than experience doing that. Remember, I said there's applying procedural knowledge, so knowledge of how to do something, and through skill transfer, maybe they've done something similar to that. You need to figure out what would be similar to that for developing your equivalencies. So I want to talk now about preferred qualifications. So preferred qualifications are a great way to further reduce the applicant pool. When I say that, it sounds like we're trying to get rid of people, but really, we don't want to be wasting our time or their time by bringing people into the selection process who are not going to be at least minimally qualified, who have kind of no chance whatsoever. So, you know, minimum qualifications are things like, when we are preferred qualifications are things like when we say associate's degree required, bachelor's degree preferred. Supposedly, if someone had a bachelor's degree, we're assuming that they've got more of those knowledge, skills, and abilities that would make someone a better job performer. And experience in customer service position required. Some experience in a lead or supervisor position preferred. Um, Now, the preferred qualifications are not usually part of the minimum qualification screen. It's usually an additional step. We usually do the minimum qualification screen, and then after that, maybe we want to continue to reduce down our applicant pool to a more manageable group of people to go into the selection process. A lot of people think of that that preferred qualification screen is kind of happening right after the minimum qualification screen, but still not part of the selection process. Technically, it's happening kind of over here. It's just before the selection process where you're making your final decisions on who goes into the selection process. But the thing is, it really is part of the selection process, just like we should be thinking of the minimum qualification screen as part of selection. That preferred qualification screen is also part of selection. Remember, you are still using your preferred qualifications, or your also known as desirable qualifications. You're still using those um, to make employment decisions. You're deciding who is going to be selected, even to go into the selection process. That is a selection procedure. Um, so they need to be developed with the same consideration of validity and fairness and all of that. If you think about our candidates or our applicants slash candidates and their qualifications, and their qualifications are, they're really on a continuum from kind of at the bottom end, what I would consider not at all qualified. They're not going to make it. They kind of have none of those KSAs, and you know, a lot of people apply for jobs we've without even any of those kind of any of the qualifications whatsoever. Um, we're really going to end up hiring someone up here, though. We're not looking down at that low end, but we want to get someone who is as close to the top of that continuum, that scale as possible. The top being like what we would call journey level, or the level of qualifications of the people who are already performing the job. We would really like to get people who are just like them. They're already doing the job. They can come in, they can sit down and just start working, start doing the job. But there's a lot of training that goes on, and ramping up as people get hired. And so no one is, few people are going to be quite journey level for your particular job, day one on the job. But we're likely going to hire someone in that area, just, sort of below that. But we set our minimum qualifications low enough to make sure that um, everyone who may be qualified, still gets some consideration. We're bringing them into the selection process. So we want to set it, low enough so we get enough of those people, but we want to set it again high enough so that anyone below that point, um, they wouldn't have a chance at all in the selection process. So we don't want to even bring them in. So you can see with minimally qualified, and just in this example, minimally qualified is kind of that middle of the continuum. We're likely going to hire someone kind of up at the top, but that leaves kind of a big gap between the minimally qualified and where we're really going to consider people. Well, that's what sort of the preferred qualifications area on the continuum. So the preferred qualifications then sort of kick in, and they're going to take some of those people and bump them up a little bit. They're going to show a little bit more, that they've got a little bit more of what we're looking for, kind of moves them up the continuum. Preferred qualifications, really important to remember that it's not the nice to haves. It's not those things that we want people to have just generally. things that make people just a better employee, a better worker, better coworker. They're just generally smarter, they're faster, they're a nicer person. There have been lots and lots of lawsuits in the past based on this. A lot of discrimination has happened. In fact, a landmark court case back in the 60s, Griggs v. Duke Power. Um, Duke Power had a power company, or Duke Power had a power plant in rural North Carolina, and they were hiring people for their power plant, and they were requiring applicants to have a high school diploma when there was really no way to show that people had to have a high school diploma, and so they were um, they were being generous, for people who didn't have a high school diploma. They were asking them to take a an intelligence test. They were thinking that if people pass the intelligence test, they would be better, they would be smarter, faster learners, and whatever by having a higher level of intelligence. Long story short, there was adverse impact, and the process went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court ruled that there was no way for them to know that, or to determine that by having a certain level of intelligence, they would be a better person, a better worker, and learn faster, and all of that. And that was absolutely invalid. And they couldn't say that those things would necessarily make someone better at their job, because there was no job analysis. They never actually studied the job to determine what it would take for someone to be successful on the job. It was just a nice to have. And there have been countless countless lawsuits based on this nice to have, and things that, we want people to be more like us, or more like, that person on the job who is, smart and learns fast, and all of that. So it's really important that our preferred qualifications, that we realize that it's part of the selection process. And so our preferred qualifications need to be based on the same stuff that our regular selection process is based on. Just like the minimum qualifications, it needs to be based on job analysis and identifying things that are maybe not necessary day one on the job, but would definitely make someone uh, more qualified. So, for example, there are lots of places where we get these preferred qualifications. Uh, Now, remember, it all goes back to those KSAs, those knowledge, skills, and abilities that we've identified as being important for the job. Now, our minimum qualifications, as I mentioned before, we're not going to base minimum qualifications on everything. We just want to take the most critical KSAs and make sure that people at least have the most critical KSAs at a basic level. So there are other KSAs that would lead to better job performance that aren't part of our minimum qualifications. Those could be preferred qualifications as well. And also in our job analysis, remember, we're identifying KSAs that are important for performing the job, but then we're also identifying a subset of those KSAs that are needed upon entry into the job, versus something that, is needed for the job, but later on in the job because you're going to sort of learn it after hire. Well, we can take those KSAs that are needed for performing the job. If we've determined that if someone had more of a particular knowledge, skill, or ability, they would necessarily be a better performer on the job, and those would be great for a preferred qualification. So let's look at, for example, knowledge of business statistics. If that's important and needed at entry, then that's a great minimum qualification. But maybe knowledge of state financial reporting practices is important for performing the job, but it's not determined to be needed at entry. People generally learn that on the job, once they're hired, but that's a great preferred qualification as long as we can show that someone who has that particular knowledge is going to be the better performer. They're going to be a little bit better at their job. That's a perfect preferred qualification. There can also be contextual performance-based KSAs. So contextual performance is not what you do. It's not related to a specific task, but how you perform the job overall, how you perform sort of the entire job or whole groups of tasks, things like ability to work cooperatively in a team environment. So that's a really good preferred qualification. because it's not related to any one particular task. So it's hard to say, you know, it's kind of hard to quantify, but so it makes for a good preferred qualification if we say something like experience working in a team environment preferred. So it's preferred. You could probably learn if you haven't worked in a team environment before. You could probably learn how to do it if have good, social skills. You can get along with people and work cooperatively with others or whatever. But people who have already worked in a team environment are probably going to do that a little bit better. They're going to pick up on that faster. We know that they know what it's like to work in that sort of cooperative environment. So contextual performance KSAs are really good. But remember that with the preferred qualifications, you have to be able to demonstrate job relatedness. Remember, job relatedness, that's where we are selecting people or making those employment decisions based on things that are needed for performing that particular job and nothing else. So the experience indicates possession of an important KSA. So we don't want to just say experience working in a team environment because, people generally have to work in a team environment in this organization. So we kind of generally want it. It should have been identified in your job analysis as something that is critical for performing the job. People have to be able to do this in order to perform the job. Therefore, we would prefer that people had that. All right. So we're going to come up on the hour shortly. So I want to just kind of back up and sort of summarize what I've been talking about. We need to think about the minimum qualification screen. So that's the whole process of taking those minimum qualifications, comparing it to the applicants, the applications and the resumes, and screening out anyone who doesn't have those minimal qualifications. We need to think of that screen as part of the selection process because it is actually a test. Test just meaning it's a selection procedure, and so therefore it has to be developed with the same consideration of content validity. Content validity is kind of the same as job relatedness, just means that the content of the selection process represents important aspects of the actual job so that we're selecting people based on what is really needed for the job. So you should make developing and reviewing your minimum qualifications part of that selection process development, because hopefully you're already doing some kind of job analysis or you're reviewing the job, you're working with subject matter experts to determine what it takes to be successful in the job and whatever. So you should use the results of that to either develop your minimum qualifications or look at your minimum qualifications and make sure that they are still valid. They should be Minimum qualifications should be based on the most current knowledge about a particular job. And like I said before, they're often they've often been around for a really long time, as you know. And you probably have run across situations where you do all this work to develop a new selection process, like a new interview or something like that, but you're going back and you're using those same old minimum qualifications, bachelor's degree, 3 years experience, without thinking about, does this really get at what makes someone minimally qualified and acceptable to go into our selection process? When you're developing minimum qualifications, don't focus on the job. Don't think, it's okay, it's a job in the finance department. Therefore, what does that mean? They should probably have finance educate finance education or whatever. You need to focus on the KSAs that are needed for the job. So, not what is the appropriate type and amount of education experience because it's a finance job, but what education and experience would demonstrate possession or likely possession. We have to, kind of make an assumption about the knowledge, skills, and abilities people have based on that at the level needed for minimally acceptable job performance. It's just a way of reframing it. But like I've been arguing, if if we just reframe it that way and think about our minimum qualifications as part of the selection process, they would be based on actual knowledge of the job and they would be valid and they would work so much better. You want to Get creative too in your minimum qualifications. And by that, I mean, think of all of the possible ways that someone could demonstrate those KSAs. Don't assume that don't assume that, okay, we need to identify education. Is it going to be, an AA degree or a bachelor's degree or whatever? Think of other ways, maybe not just education. Um, you know, there is, there is a move to eliminate those strict degree requirements. And really, that's based on the fact that you can't always say that just having a bachelor's degree is going to make someone better at a particular job. But that's why you need to break it down and look at the different KSAs and think, okay, in this particular degree program, would they have gained those particular KSAs? And also, really important to remember that more isn't necessarily better. More education isn't necessarily better. More experience isn't necessarily better. Remember, I said that someone who's been on the job for 10 years isn't necessarily better at the job than someone who's been on the job for 5 years. There is a right amount. And also remember, we're not looking for the ideal candidate. I think I mentioned that, we tend to make the mistake when we're developing minimum qualifications of looking for the ideal candidate, saying we want people to have this kind of experience and we want this education. Yeah, we want it. We would like to have people who are the absolute most qualified. So they're going to be way up there at the end of that continuum. But we're likely to be eliminating people who are actually qualified. They just didn't get to demonstrate their minimum qualifications in the right way. And remember that preferred qualifications aren't just those nice to have things, but they really need to be based on the job analysis. So maybe those KSAs that are needed for performing the job and would make someone a better performer, but maybe aren't needed day one on the job. But if someone had it, they would be better. And so therefore, they're the better selection. And very, very important when doing this, always use subject matter experts. Don't try to imagine what it would take to have gained certain knowledge in finance or in IT or something. If you work in HR, like most of us, we don't really know. We don't really have that expertise. So use subject matter experts. And these are people who they're knowledgeable job incumbents. They perform the job. They know what it takes to be successful in the job. And then knowledgeable supervisors and maybe managers who have good knowledge of the job and they've seen different people in the job and they know what it takes to be successful versus the people who have struggled a little bit. So always use subject matter experts in helping you translate those KSAs into those real world activities. What would it have taken to have gained this particular knowledge or this particular skill? And we are up on the hour. I think we could maybe take a couple of questions, but I did want to point out that if you have questions that we can't get to, and because we're kind of out of time, feel free to contact me by email, and you can see my email, gburcaw@cpshr.us. Feel free to email me at any time with questions or comments or whatever if you need help with minimum qualifications or anything else. And also, I'd recommend that you check out cpshr.us, our website, and see all of the various things that CPSHR can do for you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. I hope you all are leaving today with so many takeaways. Before we head into Q&A, I think we have time just for one question real quick. Yes, this session was recorded. Please be on the lookout for an email tomorrow with the link to the recording and the slide deck that you saw here today. Finally, we would really appreciate it if you could complete the short survey that will pop up at the close of this session. Your feedback helps make our future webinars even better. And thank you again to Jeff, and thank you to all of you for spending time with us today. We hope you will join us next month on July 15th for our webinar on addressing workplace incivility with confidence and professionalism. And our
Can I just
one,
can I
sorry, go
just
ahead, Jeff.
I want to address Vanessa's
Okay.
question because you could get in trouble. Someone could get in trouble, and I want to point out. So Vanessa says, state of California minimum qualifications often seem to be tied to the job specifications. Absolutely. And they're kind of, for the state of California, they're often kind of written in stone. Like those MQs have been around forever and ever. Are you suggesting the hiring manager should alter those? No, I want to be really clear. Don't go alter anything that's written in that state spec. Talk to your HR folks. They'll probably tell you, no, we can't do it. In fact, they're not allowed to go outside of those specs very much at all without Cal HR getting involved. So I wanted to point that out because you could get in trouble. But so talk to your HR folks about if you think you're not getting minimally qualified people or you're getting too many people in the hiring process, talk to your HR folks about that. I wanted to throw that in there.
Thank you, Jeff. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. If you do have a question, feel free to email Jeff personally, or you may ask it in the survey feedback in the last question. Just note your name and your email address so we can reply. Other than that, thank you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll see you next month. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining me.